In this set of lectures, we're going to talk about the cerebellum. Cerebellum literally means little brain. It's situated here underneath of the occipital lobe. It's about 10% of the brain's mass, but contains about 50% of its neurons. So the cerebellar cortex has what's called a granule cell layer, which is really densely packed with neurons, and we'll talk about that in the last segment of this lecture. It also forms the roof of the fourth ventricle. Gross anatomy of the cerebellum, as you recall from the last slide, it sits underneath the occipital lobe. So if we remove the occipital lobe, then you're looking down on this image of the cerebellum. So just out of the plane of the slide, on top of it would be sitting the occipital lobe. And here is the brainstem. There are two cerebellar hemispheres. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And within each hemisphere, we have a couple of lobes. We have an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. These are separated by the primary fissure, which kind of runs along here. You'll note that the surface of the cerebellum has all of these little lines. And these are kind of the equivalent of sulci and gyri in the cortex, where you have big gyri and big sulci, so you have kind of a gross appearance of the brain. In the cerebellum, these are much finer and smaller, and we call them folia. And folia, I believe, means page. And so if you think about a portfolio is pages, and so the folia of the cerebellum are almost like the pages of a book. They're very small and very thin when you compare them to the sulci and gyri of the cerebral cortex. On the midline is this structure that early anatomists thought looked like a worm, and so they called it the vermis. Vermis means worm-like. From the ventral side, if we cut off the brainstem and are looking up underneath the cerebellum, we can still see the vermis. We can see part of that anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. And if we remove the brainstem, what we can see are some midline structures. We see the flocculus, which is over here and over here. And we see the nodulus here. These three structures are combined into what we call the flocculo-nodular lobe. Now you wonder, why do I need to know these lobes? Well, the bottom line is that the different lobes of the cerebellum have different functions and are related to different sensory systems within the nervous system, and have different areas of motion that they're involved with. We're not going to go into those very deeply, but we'll talk a little bit about that in the last section. In the next section, we're going to talk about these guys, the peduncles, that actually physically attach the cerebellum to the brainstem. In this segment, we'll discuss the cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellar peduncles are large fiber tracts that carry information to and information away from the cerebellum. In this particular section, we can see the entire brainstem, beginning with the medulla and the pons and the midbrain. We can sort of see where our peduncles are. Here is the area of the superior, the middle, which is the largest, and the inferior. In the next slide, in this section, or on this slide, you can see the peduncles a little more clearly, in that this is a rubber brainstem. And so it's kind of a super large image of the whole brainstem. And here we can see, again, the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain, about in here and here. And we can see our superior peduncle, our large middle peduncle, and our smaller inferior peduncle. In the next slide, I'll talk more about what they actually do. The superior cerebellar peduncle is the main outflow of the cerebellum. So a lot of information comes into the cerebellum, but its main outflow, or efferent exiting information, is going to be found in the fibers of the superior cerebellar peduncle. The middle cerebellar peduncle is bringing afferent or arriving information into the cerebellum, and most of those fibers arrives in the pons. The inferior cerebellar peduncle is bringing in afferent information from the medulla and the spinal cord. These are going to be important. Each of these peduncles and the information it's carrying is going to be important in the next couple of sections when we talk about the actual functioning of the cerebellum. So in the next section, we'll talk a little bit about the cerebellar cortex. And for now, what I want you to know is that there are 3 different peduncles, and each one of them is bringing in or taking away information from a different source. In the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about the function of the cerebellum. So why do you have a cerebellum? Well, the cerebellum is really important for all of your motor behaviors. It compares your intended motor behavior with what's actually happening, and it helps you adjust, okay? So it gets input from the brainstem and spinal cord, where your motor centers are, and then it sends output back into the motor cortex. So when you think about it, you imagine doing a particular motor behavior, like the perfect layup or riding your bicycle. And as you're doing those things, you've imagined the motion. Your cerebellum then kind of checks in with your cortex and with your sensory information from the spinal cord and brainstem and says, yeah, you're getting it right, or oh no, we need to adjust a little bit. And it helps with those adjustments. The cerebellum also helps a lot with balance. So the cerebellum receives a lot of information from the vestibular system in your middle ear. We'll talk about the vestibular system a little bit when we talk about cranial nerve 8, but you know that your middle ear is associated with balance. And the cerebellum is highly connected via the brainstem to your middle ear to allow you to compensate for balance, and of course then sends that information back out to the motor cortex to help you adjust your behaviors. And the cerebellum is incredibly important for muscle tone and synergy. So when you go to pick up your laundry basket or pick up an egg, you have a really good idea of how much muscle force you need to use. The cerebellum helps you coordinate the balance between your flexors and extensors so that you pick up your laundry basket with just the right amount of force, and don't try to pick it up and then fall over into it, or you don't pick it up and throw your clothes all over the place. It also allows for that kind of fine motor control that you need to adjust to when you're picking up an egg versus picking up a rock. So it helps you with the amount of force or the amount of contraction that you need to use in each of your muscle groups in order to perform a smooth and elegant motor behavior. In the next section, we'll talk more about the cerebellar cortex. So as I mentioned in the very beginning of this lecture, the cerebellar cortex has about 50% of your entire brain's neurons. We couldn't put them all in this illustration, but they're here in what's called the granule cell layer. So the cerebellar cortex basically has 3 layers. There's an outer molecular layer. There's kind of an intermediate Purkinje cell layer. And there's this inner granule cell layer, and this is where the cells are really, really dense. tons and tons of cells. The molecular layer doesn't have a lot of neurons in it. It has some, but not very many. It mostly has the dendritic arbor, all of these dendrites that are extending from this giant Purkinje cell. And here's another one. And here's another one. Then, of course, they live in the Purkinje cell layer. The Purkinje cells are amazing. They extend this huge dendritic arbor, but what's fascinating about it is that it's all in one plane. So it's not it's only two-dimensional. It's not three-dimensional like most dendritic arbors. It is one-dimensional. And these Purkinje cells all throughout the Purkinje cell layer are going to have different orientations of their dendritic arbors. That difference in dendritic arbor orientation is going to determine which of these granule cells, pictured here, is going to synapse with it. So you can see these granule cells send an axon up into the molecular layer, and then it goes along the edge here and synapses on the Purkinje neurons. The cerebellar cortex gets information, as we talked about, from the brainstem and from the spinal cord, and areas of the brainstem concerning balance, and areas of the spinal cord that have to do with the position of your muscles in space. All of this information comes into the cortex via the middle and inferior peduncles, and some of the fibers are going to synapse directly on the Purkinje cells, and some are going to synapse on these granule cells that will then synapse on the Purkinjes. The Purkinje cells then take all of this information and they send it back out down to the deep gray matter of the cerebellum. So information is coming into the cerebellum, going up to the cortex, up to a Purkinje cell, and then back down through the cerebellar white matter to synapse in one of these deep cerebellar nuclei. In this particular section, let me clear the drawing, you can see the dentate. This is the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum. The dentate nucleus and the other deep nuclei of the cerebellum are the part of the cerebellum that then sends information out to the motor cortex via the superior peduncle. So information in through the middle and inferiors, going through some complex circuitry up in the cerebellar cortex, output of the cortex to the deep cerebellar nuclei, and from the deep cerebellar nuclei back out to the motor cortex. And that is how the cerebellum can keep tabs on your spinal cord and your brainstem, and then inform your motor cortex about how what you're doing is actually matching up what you think you're doing or you think you want to do. So in summary, what I want you to know about the cerebellum is I want you to be able to describe its gross anatomy. So think about how many hemispheres and lobes and other named areas. What are the cerebellar peduncles? How many cerebellar peduncles are there? What are their names? What kind of fibers travel in each one of the cerebellar peduncles? When it comes to the cerebellar cortex, how many layers? What are their names? And why are they named differently? So what's going on in each layer? And then when it comes to the cerebellum talking back to the rest of the nervous system, how does this information leave? What's the last stop in the cerebellar train before it goes out? And then how does it get out? If you know all of those kinds of things, then you're ready for the assessment.